All right, so I know the schedule right now says middleware and then user authentication a little bit later. We do have to make a little bit of time from Wednesday, so we're going to jump back into our to-do list and wrap up talking about Redux form, and then we'll jump straight into talking deeper about middleware. So we want everybody, open your terminal, go to your front end folder. And then from your front end folder, you should be able to go into your Redux to-do list. You left up on the add item branch. Make sure you open your code editor, start your server. Okay. Should have something that resembles this. Should be pulling a list of to-do items from the server. And then we have a way to navigate to our add item form. And if I remember correctly, should be able to type into our inputs. Click add item and get the console log of the form values from the essentially the handle submit function. Still quite a bit of cleanup we need to do. For one, like the labels. We want to make sure we could do custom labels, and then we want to talk about validation a little bit, and then we want to talk about actually sending that data to the server. Everybody to this point working? So far, so good? All right. So first thing we want to figure out is how can we dynamically set the label up here. So we have our little render input method that builds each of our inputs. And there we have our label, but we want to be able to dynamically set this. Because obviously you don't want just to say label here for all your inputs. That'd be very confusing to your user. And we can't just hard code something here because no matter what we put here, it'll be the same for every input. So we want to be able to dynamically set that. So one nice feature that Field has is any prop you put on it. So let's just make one up and call it label. And this is the title with a capital T. And we could do another label down here for details. So any prop we put on Field, if we look over here, we can see that our console log from our render input function now has label inside of that object. So all the props get passed all the way through. And it could be anything. Label is not like a special one-off item. We could say animal equals kittens. Oh, 2 T's, not 2 I's. So no matter what we put here, it'll get passed up to our render input. We can see now in the console log, now that one input has the animal prop on it. You can put anything, any information you need to put that you need to pass up to help build out your inputs, you can add on there. Right now, all we really care about is label.
I have a question about that.
Yes.
Couldn't you just use the name that's already there, like props.input.name?
You could use the name. Two reasons why we don't. One, because the name is not going to always coincide with what you want the label to say.
Okay.
I mean, even here, it's a small difference. We're using capital letters instead of lowercase letters. We could, capitalize that first letter, but then you're pigeonholed into whatever name you give it. That's what your label's going to be. Okay. Sometimes you use dashes, underscores. So they're not always going to be so close to each other. Very good question, though. All right, so now that we have props.label up here, we can see that from our console log. So label is in this props object. We could delete label here, do curly brackets to do a JavaScript expression, and we can say props.label. Now, if we look at our code up here, we have proper labels on each of our inputs. We have title and then details. Okay. So little improvement right there. Next, what we want to do is we want to make sure that you can't submit the form with any empty values. What's more important, validation on the front end or validation on the server side? Server side always. You can get around front-end validation. Front-end validation is strictly for user experience, UX. Okay? We want to be as kind and useful to people that are trying to properly use our site. We want to make sure we give them proper feedback and let them know where they mess stuff up. But not a requirement. What's more important is on the server that your data is what it should be. Because people can send data to your server other ways other than your form. They could get around the code for the form. There's a lot of different things they could do to circumnavigate whatever front-end validation you do. Remember, front-end code is exposed to the world. So you could never 100% hide anything in your front-end code, any front-end API keys, all that stuff. There's no way to 100% protect that stuff. Because your whole code base is visible to anybody that knows how to use the terminal. Now, most people don't. Most people don't even know it's there. I'm sure most of you didn't know it was there. Maybe you've opened it once or twice before coming here and you kind of knew of its existence, but didn't really understand it. I know I didn't. I mean, I had opened it maybe once or twice. I had no idea what I was looking at and closed it. The average person doesn't know this is here. But people that are wanting to hurt your server know this is here and know how to manipulate your front-end code. So the server is the last line of defense to validate data. But with all that said, we still want to generate a nice user experience. And it's nice to give real-time feedback to what the user may be messing up with. So Redux form has a really nice way of handling errors in the form. So we're going to scroll down to the bottom of the file. Before we do that, everybody got their label showing up properly? So somewhere down around the bottom here, we can define a function. We can say function, and we'll call it validate. The name of the function does not matter. It could be anything. Ultimately, when this function gets called, it's going to pass us an object with all of our form values. Okay? And then we could use this object to do checks based on what we think, however we want to validate our input. So I'm going to deconstruct. So I'm going to say const, curly brackets. Now this values object that's passed to us will have properties on it exactly the same as our field names. Okay? So right now we have two inputs, a title and a details. So down here, this values object will have a titles property and a details property. Okay, so we want to pull each of those values off, and they will be whatever the input value is at the time this function was called. This function pretty much gets called every time you're typing into the input, an input loses focus. It gets called several times throughout the interaction of the form. So now that we have our values from our inputs, we could do any type of checks we want. To keep it simple for this example, we're just going to make sure that our inputs are not empty. So we'll say if not title. And then we create some kind of error. And we save that error into an error object. So back up at the top, we're going to create errors. The name of this also doesn't matter. All that matters is that it's an object. And then if there's an error, if there's something wrong with the title input, we create a property in the object we're going to return from this function, in this case the errors object, by the same property name. And we'll say, please give your item a title. Okay. The way this validation works is whatever object is returned from here, it'll check to see if that object has any properties that match any of your inputs. If there's any values on any of your properties that match your inputs, it'll then put that information into the error category on your input. So we'll see the end result of this in a second. But this just works by returning an object with property names that match your inputs. If Redux form finds a match, it assumes that you're trying to put an error on something. You could do regex here. You could do any type of checks to your form values. Okay? Title and details will have exactly whatever our inputs have in it. So we could, like I said, regex, any other type of checks. You could check the length of them to see if, maybe if it's a password field, maybe it needs to be at least 8 characters long. Whatever feedback you want to give to the user. And you don't have to do this as a string. You could do it like as an array of errors. It could be an object of errors. Okay? It could be any data type you want. Most commonly, you'll probably use it as a string, though, especially in the beginning. Just keep it nice and simple. And then we'll also check to make sure that there's details. So we'll say if not details, errors dot details equals please give your item some details. And then we just return that object. Okay? This makes the validation pretty straightforward. Like I said, you have direct access to what each of your inputs are, and you can do any type of checks you want to validate that input. We're doing very simple checks here, but you can do as complicated checks as you need to for whatever form you're working on. All right, and then the last thing is to plug this validate function into our form, and we do that in our configuration object right here. So right where we set the form name, we add another property called validate, and then set it to whatever our validation function is. In this case, I also called it validate, but it doesn't have to be called validate. It doesn't matter what it's called because you're setting it to a validate property here. This key right here does matter. This has to be validate. That's where Redux form is going to check for a validation function. If it's not there, it just won't use it. But if there is a validate property in the config object, it'll call that function, pass it all your inputs, and then take the return value and set any errors to the appropriate inputs. Now, I called it validate intentionally, so if you understand, we could just do that. Okay? I'm going to leave it written out all the way. But just know that because I called it the same as what the property name was, I don't have to say validate equals validate. It'll do that automatically for me. But just to make it as clear as possible, I'll leave it written out. You can do it either way that you feel more comfortable with. If you don't understand the automatically setting a property name based on the variable name, then don't use it yet. Eventually, it'll click and you'll understand it, but you don't need to force yourself into doing it. There's no coding or like performance benefit or anything like that. It's strictly just to save you a little typing. All right. So up in our render input, we're already logging up, console logging our props. So let's test this out. So if I find my render input arguments console log, I have all the input data. We already put that onto the input. That's what makes the input function and ties it into Redux form, giving us our functionality. Our label we added there for our label. Then there's this meta object. And if we scroll down, we could see there's an error property that has our error message on it. Okay? Does this input have any text in it yet? Did we type in it? No. And also we're checking to see if there's anything in it. If it exists, and it doesn't, so the error got added to that input. Or this is the details one. If I look at the one above it, it'll be the title one. And they should both have errors because we didn't type into either one of them yet. So here's the error for title. Please give your item a title. Here's an error for the details one. All right. And then if I type into title, and then I re-look at my meta object, and we go find where error is now undefined because there's no error there. Because the only check we're doing is to see if it's empty. It's not empty anymore, so there's no error. So let's use that information to actually display that to the user. So we could do that. We could add down below our input, we could add a p tag, maybe. With a class of red-text, curly brackets, do props dot meta dot error. Actually going to darken up the red text a little bit, so I'm going to say text dash darken dash 2. Yep, that's just to make it red. There's no other functionality other than that. So now when we look at our form, we should see the errors for each input. Let's check it out and see if we do. So we do. Now, how many times have you gone to a form on the internet and it's telling you you messed it up right out the gate? No. Usually not. I'm not going to say it's never happened. I'm sure there's somewhere out in the wild world of the internet, there's a form somewhere that does this. But this isn't a very good user experience. You don't want to be yelling at the user before they've even attempted to do something. We want to wait till they've at least interacted with the form before we start telling them that they're wrong. So we need to know if the users interacted with each input before we display an error. And once again, we go back to this meta object. This meta object has all the information about the input, whether it's been interacted with, whether it's had stuff in it at one point or another, whether it has an error, all the information you could ever want to know about the input and more. There's dirty. Dirty means hasn't been typed into. So even if it's been typed into, and even if you clear it back out, dirty will become true. Once that input has been typed into, it is now dirty. There's invalid. That kind of goes along with the error. If there's an error, it's invalid. Pristine means it's never been touched. The user has not interacted with it at all. Then there's the actual touched. Touched is false because we haven't touched it yet. Valid, visited. There's all kinds of information that gets triggered at different points with the user's interaction. So we're going to keep it simple right now, and we're just going to use touched. We're just going to check to see if the user input has been touched. If it has been touched and there's an error, then we'll display the error. So we essentially need to make a decision right here. So you might be thinking, oh, we can do a ternary. We could do a ternary. But what if I was to tell you there's an even simpler way to make a decision than a ternary even? An even more concise way to write it. So what we could do is, before error, we could do props dot meta dot touched and props dot meta dot error. Okay. If touched is false, we never use and. It never goes any farther, because as soon as one side of this is false, it's no longer true. So if this is false, JavaScript won't go any further with this. If touched is true, and then whatever's here will be essentially output. If there's errors undefined, there's nothing to output. But if there's a string here, then we'll see that string output. Okay? So this is a shorter way to do this. You could use ORs. You could chain a whole bunch of ands or ORs together. If you understand the way comparisons, or not comparisons, if you understand the way conditionals work in JavaScript, this is a very neat little trick to use, especially in React when you're trying to display information. Because you can check a couple different things, and if it makes it to the end, then it'll display something. At any points that hit false, then it won't display. So let's see what we have now. So no errors, but if I come to my input and then I go away from it, now I have errors because now they've been touched. As soon as oh my gosh, hold on really quick. I'm going to turn my auto complete. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. I'm just doing it so you guys can actually see the errors. Let's try this again. So if I go to it, touch it, error, touch it, error. As soon as I start typing, the error goes away. That validate function runs on every key press. It also runs as soon as, once again, on pretty much any event having to do with that form, that validate function is running. Which is why when I just touch the input and then go away from it, we get an error. Also, at this point, if I delete this, my error comes back. So we get instant feedback of what's going on. Okay. And also, if there is an error on the form, it won't let us submit it. So you can see, although I got a bunch of console logs, I did not get my actual submitted form console log. It does not let you submit it. And when you try to submit the form, it runs the validation one final time. Okay? Just in case something else was missed, it'll validate it. And then if it's not valid, the form, it will never run the handle submit function. So you don't have to worry about doing a check yourself. Redux form already does that for you. Pretty cool. If you actually try to recreate this functionality on your own, it's a pain in the butt. I've done it. It's hard to get it to this level and essentially this easy. It might, as usual, kind of seem like a lot initially, but it's actually doing so much work for you for very little effort on your end. And to me, this is the biggest selling point of Redux form, is the error handling. It's very nice. There's a lot of other cool stuff Redux form does. I said just the sheer handling of updating the Redux state and all that stuff that you don't have to do now. You don't have to, make sure you're updating the state on every key press. It's already doing all that stuff for you. All right, there's one more cool trick I want to show you guys. This is just kind of an aside. This isn't something you have to do. This is just more ES6 magic stuff. I'm going to delete this console log. So in here, we're saying props dot, props dot, props dot, props dot. We're using props over and over again. So this is a perfect example of where destructuring would probably save you a little bit of typing. So we'd want to do some destructuring here. And normally when we do destructuring, we say const, curly brackets. We'd want to pull off like input, label, meta. And we actually want to dive into the meta object. So we'll do some like nested destructuring. We want touched. And we want air. And that all comes from that props object. Okay. And then we could delete that and just use label. We could delete this and just use dot dot input. We could delete props dot meta and just use touched. And we could delete props dot meta and just use air. So a little bit cleaner down in here to look at and read. Okay, this should work. But we could actually take this a step further. Okay, we can actually eliminate another line of code here. But before we do that, let's test it, make sure everything's still working. So air's still working, type, submit, form values. Great, everything's still working. Everybody with me, or does anybody need a second? Okay. Does anybody know what I'm about to show you guys? Favorite guesses? This is no fun.
Oh, never mind.
Glad I could help.
Just by raising my hand. Just seeing your face, that's all. All right. Now.
If anybody needs help, let me know. How's everybody feel their final projects are going?
Nothing's caught on fire yet.
So that's always a huge one.
Yeah.
That thing's blown up.
Well, we've had several things minorly blow up.
All in the
We were able to
past.
fix them though.
All in the past.
It's coding.
Moving
No
forward.
matter how long you've been doing it for, it'll always blow up. There'll always be bugs and stuff will always blow up. All good? Cool. So we actually don't even need this line to do destructuring. We could take our destructuring from curly brace to curly brace, make sure you get all the curly brackets, and cut it, delete this line, and then we're going to replace props with our destructuring. You could actually destructure in your parameter list. Okay? So as something is passed to you, you destructure it. Now this is just destructuring whatever that first argument is. But if we had a second argument, we could put a comma here and destructure whatever the next thing is. So we do that, and then if we were getting another object, we could destructure that one, so on and so forth. Okay? Just remember that one argument we were passed had all these properties on it. Okay? So we're expecting as the first parameter to be an object.
I can rate things for you on your iPhone.
Oh, that's good. You turn that feature off. It keeps doing that. Anyways, so we're expecting that first parameter of render input to be that props object. We already know the properties that we're going to be pulling off of it. So we could just do it in right there in the parameter list. Once again, this is a nice quote unquote trick to save you some time. If you're completely confused by this, don't have to use it. There's no real, once again, there's no real advantage to it other than just saving you some typing. After you've been coding for a while, you'll really appreciate this stuff a lot more. Right now, it's probably just like, why do I need to know all this more confusing crap? But in time, you will appreciate all these neat little tricks. And you can do this in any function anywhere. Okay? It's not like it's a special functionality of Redux form. It's just how functions work in JavaScript. So we could even come down to our validate function, where we're destructuring the values passed in. And we could do that same thing here and replace values with our destructuring, get rid of that line. Same exact thing. Okay. I'm quite fond of that, but I forget to do it more often than not. All right, so we have a form working. It validates. When we click the submit button, we get a console log from our save item method. I'm going to clean up some of these other console logs. In render, there was one. I'm going to get rid of that. I think I already got rid of the one in render input. Okay, so the only console log we should have is in save item. So let's do one final run through, make sure everything's working, and then we'll move on to actually adding the item to the server. So if I try and submit the form right away, I get my errors. The form does not submit. I type some information into each input, hit the button, now the form submits. Everybody, you got that? Everybody good? Cool, let's send this data to the server. So we're using Redux. We want to add an item. So this kind of sounds like we need an action creator. We need to create an action. We need to create an action. We need to define an action type. So let's do that. The first place we're going to go is to our type file that is in the actions folder. So actions types. And we'll add a new type in here of add list item. And we'll set that to the string of add list item. We defined a new type. Now we just need to make a new action creator to dispatch that new action with its new type. All right, action creators we define in this index file here. So we'll jump over to the index file. Everybody good with this? Anybody need a second? All good? All right. So we're going to follow pretty much the same exact pattern as above. We're going to say export function, add photo item, and we could be a little more consistent. We can say add list item. All right. If we're going to add an item, what information do you think we need to pass into this function? The item, right? Because the item is coming from our form, so we need to be able to pass it into this function. And then the rest of this is going to be almost identical. So now we're going to say const response equals Axios. One small difference is it's going to be post. Bless you.
Thank you.
And then we need to do our URL, exact same URL. So backticks, $ curly brackets, our base URL, /totos, $ curly brackets, API key. And then because it's post, the second argument is whatever data we want to send. So I'll give it a second argument and say item. And then we're going to return types dot add list item. And then our payload will be our response. When doing Redux, you'll get very, very familiar with this pattern that repeats over and over and over and over again. Now we're eventually going to use a little bit different middleware to handle our promises called Redux Thunk. So this pattern will change a little bit, but still pretty much the same thing. All right, so now that we have that, we can test it. So let's jump back over to our add item component. And up at the top, we need to import connect because we need to connect to the Redux state. Oh my gosh, Redux. And then we need to import our action creator from backup directory actions. And it was add list item. And then if we scroll all down to the bottom, okay, so we already kind of have a mess going on here with Redux form. So now we need to add connect to this mess. And we could just kind of wrap all this with connect, but there's a little bit cleaner, a little bit easier way for legibility to do this. So instead of exporting default right here, we could actually delete the export default and we could say add item equals. So essentially redefining add item to our add item wrapped in Redux form. And then we could do export default connect, call connect returns a function, call that function, and we pass it our add item. And how many arguments does connect get? 2. First one is map stage props, which we don't have right now, so that'll be null. And the second one is our action creators. Okay, and in this case, I will make an object. Oops. And inside that object, we'll say add list item set to add list item. Okay. We could have done all of this on one line at the same time. It doesn't make any difference. This does just kind of make it a little bit more legible, relatively speaking. We could have just said connect, called connect, and then put the second call of connect around all of that. Okay. Either would do the same end results. As I felt this is just a little bit easier to digest doing it in 2 separate steps.
Good, Scott, can you go to the top? All right.
All good? Everybody good? All right, so now what we want to do is, now that we've connected our add list item action creator, it's all connected into our component now, connected into the Redux cycle. Now what we want to do is call it, we want to pass it our item, and see if it worked. So inside the save item, I will say this dot props dot add list item. I'm going to call it. Now, when we call it, it's expecting that we pass it our item. Our item is the values from the form. So we just say values. Okay, so now when we test this, in theory, it should actually add an item to our list if everything went well. So let's check it out. So Redux add test. This is a test of the Redux system. All right. So we'll click add item, and it looks like pretty much nothing happened. We did get our console log, so we know we hit our function, but we don't really know what, if anything, happened. So let's jump back over to our list and see if we see our new item. We'll go 3000, and then you see we did indeed add our list, or add it to our list. If you didn't get any errors, it should have worked. Anybody have any issues? Everyone's good? Everyone's item added? So back to our form. What would be the ideal situation to happen when we add the item?
Reset.
Go back to the to-do list. If we wanted to stay on this page, then reset would be good, but we don't really want to do anything else here, so we just want to go back to our to-do list. If you guys remember, we kind of did this before with our other one, where we could use this.props.history.push and have it navigate back. But we don't want it to navigate back right away. We want it to navigate back after it's actually added the item. So in order to do that, because we're using Redux promise, when we call this, this will actually now return a promise. So we could use async await, or you could use .then on the end of this, either one. I'm going to stick with async await. So at the beginning of our function definition, I'm going to say async. And then in front of our call to add listen, I'm going to say await. And then right below that, I'm going to say this.props.history.push. And tell it wherever I want it to take us, and I just want it to take us home. Okay. Now when you add an item, it should add the item and then navigate you back. Remember, whenever you're doing stuff with the server, you always, especially if you're trying to do something like update a list, or in this case, navigate back. When you navigate back, it's going to automatically make a request to the server because that's what that component does. Every time that component mounts, it calls the server. So we want to wait to make sure that our item's been added. So when we go back to our other component that calls the server again, that it gets the updated list. If we just navigate right away, chances are the majority of the time when it pulls the updated list, it won't have the new thing we just added because it's going to make the request faster than the other one added. So we want to make sure we wait for the add functionality to finish and then navigate away. So let's test it out, see if it worked. So another Redux test. This is another test. Okay. As soon as you click it, it adds the item, re-navigates you back to the list. That actually happens pretty fast. So usually, depending on the actions, there might be a little bit more of a delay. If there's a delay, that's a good place to put in a spinner or some kind of message. Usually you want to disable the add item button so they can't spam click it, because we're all guilty of this. If something looks like it's not working, what do? Just keep trying it. Okay? So we're not going to get into all that right now, but just keep that stuff in mind when you're building your final projects. You can end up with some pretty advanced, pretty crazy queries and pulling a lot of data from your database at one time. So there might be a little bit more of a delay than there is with this one. Okay? And if there's anything over half a second delay, you want to, like I said, make sure that the user can't keep clicking that button one way or another. And usually give them feedback to say like, hey, you know, I'm doing something, give me a second. Everybody navigate back okay? Yeah, all good? All right, go to put this in as well. I put my snippets over there. Capital A right here. Because we're essentially redefining the class. Yeah, there's a lot. So another one. Also capital A. Yep. Everyone good? All right. So what we want to do next, and pretty much the last thing we're going to do for this little project, for the moment anyways, is we want to click on this and have it take us to another page. After we navigate to that page, we want to call the server and get all that item's details. Keep in mind when you're designing a project, your final project, or any project, of how and when you're getting the data. What happens if someone's looking at your page and they hit the refresh button? Are they going to still be looking at the same thing? Very important to keep in consideration. If you're unsure if you did it right, test it. Go to that page, hit the refresh button, and are you still pulling the data? Does the data still show up? Never assume people are going to use your app properly, for one, because no one ever does. 90% of coding, and the more you get into it, you'll realize this more and more. 90% of coding is preventing people from screwing up your website or your code or your app, whatever it is. Making apps is pretty straightforward. There's actually not that much to it. It's making sure people use it properly and can't screw it up. It becomes a huge pain in the butt. Because if everybody just clicks on the right stuff at the right time and waits for stuff to happen, your app will run great. But that's not the way people use anything. You know, the calculator kind of gives you guys a little taste of that, where if you type the exact right stuff in, it works great. But as soon as you start typing weird stuff into it, it's a huge pain in the butt to handle all those edge cases. Programming is nothing but handling edge cases. All right. So we are done with this branch. So I'm going to open another tab. Do a quick git status check. Okay, looks good. Our actions, files, index and types, and our add item component. That's pretty much all we messed with. If you have package files in there, that's fine. Biggest thing that we're always checking for is that we're not about to add and commit node modules. We're not about to add and commit any credential files. Okay, that's why we do this git status checks. You're not always going to remember every single file you change, so you might see a file in here or two that's potentially surprising. Usually not a huge red flag. Definitely something to keep in the back of your mind to review when you're reviewing your changes. But you want to make sure you're not about to commit stuff you're going to regret, like your node modules folder. And even more importantly, is if you commit your node modules folder, it can be undone. It's not that big a deal. You can fix it. If you commit your credentials to GitHub, you can delete the file and get it off of GitHub, but it's still technically in your Git history, unless you do a full rebase, which is a huge nightmare. And especially, it becomes a huge nightmare for everybody in your group, because then everybody has to kind of back up with you. So, node modules folder, you don't want to commit it. It's not the end of the world. Credential files, you really don't want to commit those. If your best bet, if you commit your credential files, change your passwords. And delete it from GitHub. But somebody could dig into there and still find that file. All right, so this all looks good. Git add, git commit, completed, add item, functionality. All right, and then we'll push it. Git push origin, add item. All right, once you add command and push, we're going to jump over to GitHub and merge it to our master. I'm going to copy this little URL. So I don't have to dig through GitHub to find it. Parent pull request. Then we're going to do add item into master. Add item to to-do list complete. We're going to add item to master. Create the pull request. And then do a quick look over the files changed. Oh, I left this console log here. I want to get rid of that. So I'm going to jump back over to my code really quick. Delete that console log. Check the terminal. Do another add commit and push. Removed console.log. And then push again. I actually saw it before we pushed, but I just want to show you guys what happens if you want to make a change. All right, now that you pushed, if you go back to GitHub, you'll notice at the top of the page, it says this page is out of date, refresh. So it lets you know, like, hey, this pull request has been updated. Okay, so even though you make a pull request, I'm sure most of you guys know this by now, but just to say it out there, once the pull request is made, you can still push to that branch, and it will automatically update that pull request for you. Okay. Once it's merged, it's done, but if you still continue to use that same branch, you can still use that branch to make another pull request. Although you really shouldn't be reusing branches that much. All right, so I'm going to refresh the page. And you can see now my console log is gone. Okay, everything looks pretty okay. Nothing jumps out at me. So back over to conversation. Merge pull request, confirm merge. Delete the branch. And then back to the terminal, switch back to master. Pull the master. And delete the old branch. Branch dash lowercase d, add item. And then make sure it gives you the proper message that it deleted the branch. Big mistake I always see new people making. They don't read the feedback in the terminal. I mean, some people don't read the feedback in the console either, but that's less of a problem. It happens less than people not reading the feedback in the terminal. I know it's kind of scary in the beginning, but you should still be reading stuff it's telling you. It's usually giving you very useful information. If it says nothing, there's a good chance it worked. But if it says something, it's usually like, hey, it worked, or hey, it screwed up, here's how you can fix it. There's always, almost always some kind of feedback of why it didn't work and what you could do to fix it. Especially with a lot of the Git commands. Especially the first week or two. I'm sure everyone here is guilty of it. I've been guilty of it. You know, some Git command doesn't work, so you just keep trying it or just go on to the next step, just hoping it's still going to work. It doesn't. All you do is mess stuff up worse. So read the error messages. They're there to help. Everybody get their stuff merged back to master. All ready to go for the next task. All right, let's go ahead and take a quick break and then come back about 10 minutes and we'll carry on. This video will carry on in whatever part number we're on. +1. Or 5.